Hello everyone and welcome. Tonight we're peeling back the gilded pages of history books to look at a time we all think we know, the Middle Ages. If you're looking for an immersive and unflinching story to occupy your mind, you have certainly come to the right place. Before we journey back to this, let's call it a challenging era, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Go ahead and leave a comment to say hello. And of course, if you enjoy these deep dives into the past, please consider hitting that subscribe button so you never miss one of our historical explorations. Okay, let's set the scene. When you think of the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Is it towering castles with colourful banners snapping in the wind? Knights in shining armour on noble quests? Maybe grand feasts in a royal hall or elegant ladies in flowing gowns? That's the version we've been sold for centuries, the romanticised fairy tale version. But tonight, we're going to walk past the castle gates, away from the royal court, and into the muddy, chaotic, and often brutal reality where most people actually lived. We're exploring why you, and honestly most of us, probably wouldn't last a single day in medieval times. The truth is, for the average person, life wasn't a romantic ballad. It was a daily, grinding struggle for survival against forces that seem almost alien to us now. Imagine a world with no concept of germs, where the water you drank could kill you, and a simple cut could be a death sentence. Picture cities where streets were open sewers, where the air was thick with the stench of human waste and rotting garbage. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It was the backdrop of everyday life. This was an age where famine was a constant threat, lurking just one bad harvest away. A time when a meal might consist of something so desperate it would turn our modern stomachs. The line between survival and starvation was razor thin, and people did what they had to do. We're going to talk about it all, from the filth and the sickness to the rigid social hierarchy that decided your fate from the moment you were born. This isn't a story of kings and queens, but of the tough, resilient, and forgotten masses who endured it all. So, take a deep breath of clean, modern air, and let's step into the unvarnished world of the Middle Ages. All right, now that we've stepped into this world, the very first thing that would hit you, long before you saw anything, is the smell. I want you to truly try and imagine it, because it's something so alien to our sanitized, air-freshened lives. It's a physical assault on your senses, an overpowering, inescapable, multi-layered stench of life in its most raw and unfiltered state. This was the daily reality of a medieval town or city, a world utterly devoid of what we would recognize as sanitation. The Romans, with their ingenious aqueducts and public sewer systems, were a distant, forgotten memory. In their place was a system of convenience and chaos. So, where did this breathtaking odour come from? Well, everywhere. Let's start with your average home. There's no indoor plumbing, no toilets. You used a chamber pot. And once that pot was full, what did you do with it? You opened a window and yelled, "Gardiloo!" a warning that translates to "watch out for the water." And you tossed its contents into the street below. Now, multiply that by hundreds or thousands of homes every single day. The streets weren't paved roads, they were often little more than compacted dirt troughs designed with a central gutter. And this gutter wasn't for rainwater. It was an open sewer, flowing sluggishly with a thick soup of human and animal waste, discarded food and whatever else people needed to get rid of. But human waste was just one ingredient in this foul recipe. Animals roamed freely. Pigs, chickens, dogs and horses wandered the narrow alleyways, adding their own contributions to the muck underfoot. Butchers would slaughter animals right in their shops, tossing the blood, entrails and unusable parts directly into the street or the nearest river. Tanneries, a vital industry, stank of the ammonia from stale urine used to treat hides. Dyers dumped their chemical concoctions. The very water sources, the rivers and wells that people relied on for drinking, washing and cooking, were the final destination for all of this filth. It wasn't just dirty, it was a breeding ground for death, a perfect delivery system for diseases like cholera, dysentery and typhoid. The concept of germs was centuries away. Sickness was blamed on bad air, a miasma, or divine punishment, never on the foul water they were drinking. So as you walked through a medieval city, you would be holding a cloth over your nose, picking your way through a treacherous landscape of filth and trying desperately not to slip. This was the fundamental, inescapable backdrop of medieval urban life, and it set the stage for a constant, unwinnable war against disease.
If the air you breathed and the water you drank didn't get you, the next daily battle was simply filling your stomach.
We have this image of medieval life that involves giant turkey legs and overflowing banquet tables. And sure, for a tiny sliver of the nobility, feasts like that did happen. But for the overwhelming majority, for the serf toiling in the field, the reality of food was monotonous, grim, and perilously uncertain. The defining meal of the medieval peasant was a dish called pottage. Don't let the cosy name fool you. This was often a thin, watery stew of oats, barley, or whatever coarse grains were on hand, boiled endlessly with a few peas, onions, or cabbage from a small garden plot. It was bland, it was repetitive, and it was often the only hot meal of the day. The other pillar of their diet was bread, but forget the soft white loaf you know. The peasant's bread was a heavy, dense, dark brick made from rye or barley, known as maslin. It was gritty, tough to chew, and sometimes bulked up with less desirable things like ground beans or even sawdust during lean times. White bread made from expensive wheat flour was a status symbol. The whiter the bread, the richer the person eating it. Meat was the ultimate luxury. A peasant family might own a pig, which would be fattened up and slaughtered for the winter, its meat carefully salted and preserved to last as long as possible. But beef and venison, that was the lord's property. The forests were his, the deer were his, and poaching was a crime punished with extreme prejudice, from mutilation to hanging. A peasant caught hunting a deer was stealing directly from the noble's table, and the consequences were dire. This fragile balance could be shattered by a single event, a drought, a flood, a blight on the crops. Famine was the silent monster that haunted every medieval village. When the harvest failed, the meager stores would dwindle to nothing, and that's when true desperation set in. This is where the line between food and not food began to blur into oblivion. People would eat acorns, roots, and tree bark. They would hunt and eat squirrels, cats, dogs, and yes, even rats. In the most severe famines, there are harrowing accounts of people resorting to cannibalism. The grim image of a person driven by starvation to eat vermin isn't a sensationalist fantasy. It was a potential reality in a world where your next meal was never, ever guaranteed. This constant gnawing hunger was a fundamental engine of the medieval experience, a world away from the lavish feasts of our imagination. So, if the filth-ridden streets didn't poison you and starvation didn't claim you, what happened when you inevitably got sick or injured? You sought help, of course, but the help available in the Middle Ages could be far more terrifying than the ailment itself. Stepping into the world of medieval medicine is like stepping into a nightmare, governed not by science but by ancient flawed theories, raw superstition, and sheer guesswork. The entire practice was built on the foundation of the four humours, an idea inherited from the ancient Greeks. It was believed the body contained four liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person was perfectly balanced. Sickness, therefore, was simply an imbalance of these humours. How did they correct this imbalance? The primary go-to treatment for nearly everything, from a fever to a headache to the plague, was bloodletting. The logic was that you had an excess of hot blood, so draining some of it would restore balance. This was done in two main ways, either by applying leeches to suck the blood out, or by the barber surgeon, who would make a direct incision into a vein with a tool called a lancet. Instead of healing, this practice would often weaken an already sick patient, leaving them more vulnerable to the disease or causing them to bleed to death. It was a cure that was quite literally worse than the disease. If you needed something more invasive, like an amputation for a gangrenous wound, you wouldn't see a learned physician. You'd go to the aforementioned barber surgeon, a man whose primary job was cutting hair and shaving beards, but who also happened to have the sharpest tools in town. Imagine this. You are held down wide awake while a man saws through your bone with no anesthetic to dull the agony and no antiseptics to prevent infection. The saw itself was likely dirty from its last use. If the shock and pain didn't kill you on the spot, a raging infection almost certainly would in the following days. Survival was miraculous. Remedies for lesser problems were a bizarre cocktail of folklore and wishful thinking. A poultice of animal dung might be applied to a wound. You might be prescribed a potion containing crushed worms, urine, or other unspeakable ingredients. Epilepsy was sometimes treated by drilling a hole in the skull, a procedure called trepanning, to release the evil spirits believed to be causing the seizures. In this world, the arrival of the healer was not a sign of comfort. It was a prelude to pain, and very often a faster death. Let's say you were one of the lucky ones. You survived childhood, you had just enough food to avoid starvation, and you managed to stay healthy, avoiding the barber surgeon's blade. You were strong, you were capable, but were you free? For the vast majority of the population, the answer was a resounding no. You were born into a system that had already decided your entire life's path. This was the feudal system, a rigid pyramid of power, and if you were born at the bottom, you were a serf. It's important to understand that a serf was not technically a slave. They couldn't be bought and sold like property, but they were tied to the land in a form of bondage that was nearly as absolute. Imagine being born on a plot of land owned by a lord. That land is your entire world. You cannot leave it without the lord's permission. You cannot get married without the lord's permission. You cannot sell your own ox or even send your son to be trained for a craft without the lord's permission. You are, in essence, a part of the property, as fixed to that piece of earth as the trees and the river. Your life was one of relentless, back-breaking labor. From sunup to sundown, you worked the fields with rudimentary tools, often a heavy wooden plow pulled by a skinny ox you might have to share with a neighbor. But your work wasn't even for your own benefit. Your primary duty was to work the Lord's personal land, the demesne, for a set number of days per week for free. This was your rent. On top of that, you owed him a portion of everything you managed to grow on your own small plot of land. You paid taxes not in coin, which was rare, but in chickens, eggs, grain, and days of forced labor called boon work, especially during the critical harvest time. The control was total. You were forbidden from grinding your own grain. You had to use the Lord's mill and pay him a portion of your flour for the privilege. You couldn't bake your own bread. You had to use the lady's oven and pay a fee. It was a system designed for maximum extraction with minimum outlay. There was no ladder to climb, no path to a better life. You were born a serf, you lived as a serf, and you would die as a serf, passing on your debts and your bondage to your children. It was an inescapable, inherited prison of servitude. Life as a serf was a prison of labor. The food was scarce and the cities were cesspools. But in the mid-14th century, a new horror descended upon Europe. It was a terror that was invisible, indiscriminate, and apocalyptic in its scale. It didn't care if you were a serf or a lord, a priest or a king. It was the Great Pestilence, what we now call the Black Death. This single event so profoundly traumatized the medieval world that its shadow looms over the entire period. If all the other hardships were a chronic illness, the plague was a sudden, violent, and unstoppable cataclysm. It arrived silently, aboard merchant ships from the east, carried by fleas living on the black rats that infested the vessels. When these ships docked in European ports, the plague disembarked with them. The progression of the disease was terrifyingly swift and brutal. It began with a fever, chills, and exhaustion. Then came the telltale sign, the buboes. These were large, swollen, and excruciatingly painful lumps that appeared in the lymph nodes of the armpits, neck, and groin. As the illness progressed, these buboes would turn black as the tissue died, giving the plague its name. This was often followed by vomiting blood and delirium before death, which usually came within 2 to 5 days. There was no cure, no explanation, and seemingly no escape. The scale of the death is almost impossible for us to comprehend. It's estimated that the Black Death wiped out between 30% and 60% of Europe's entire population in just a few years. Imagine 1 out of every 2 people you know dying. Entire villages were erased from the map, cities saw their populations halved, the social fabric completely disintegrated. Terrified people abandoned their families, leaving their loved ones to die alone. Priests, fearing for their own lives, refused to administer last rites. Law and order vanished as society buckled under the weight of mass death and fear. They had no idea what was causing it. Was it a punishment from God? A poison in the air? A miasma? Was it caused by a specific alignment of the planets? This utter lack of understanding only amplified the terror. The Black Death was more than just a disease. It was a psychological atom bomb that shattered the medieval mind, leaving behind a world forever changed and steeped in a new, more intimate relationship with death itself. In a world reeling from the chaos of plague, filth, and famine, you might think that law and order would be a comfort. But justice in the Middle Ages was not about evidence, investigation, or fairness. It was a terrifying spectacle of power, pain, and divine intervention. The concept of innocent until proven guilty did not exist. An accusation alone was often enough to condemn you, and the methods used to determine guilt were based on the belief that God himself would pass judgment, often through a brutal life or death test known as trial by ordeal. Imagine being accused of a crime. With no witnesses, the court couldn't decide, so you are subjected to the ordeal by fire. You are forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for 10 paces. Your hand is then bandaged and sealed. 3 days later, the bandages are removed. If the wound is healing cleanly, God has proclaimed your innocence. If it is festering and infected, which, in a world without hygiene, was almost certain, you are declared guilty and swiftly punished. Another common method was trial by water. You would be bound and thrown into a river or lake that had been blessed. If you sank, the pure water had accepted you, and you were declared innocent, though you probably drowned. If you floated, the water had rejected your guilty soul, and you would be pulled out to be executed. If you were a nobleman, you could face trial by combat, fighting your accuser to the death. It was believed that God would grant victory to the man who was in the right. For commoners, punishment was a public spectacle, meant to terrify the populace into obedience. For minor crimes like public drunkenness or selling bad bread, you'd be locked in the stocks or a pillory in the town square. This was not just confinement, it was a license for public humiliation. You were helpless as the townsfolk pelted you with rotten vegetables, mud, and animal dung for hours, sometimes days. For more serious crimes like theft, the punishment was often mutilation, the chopping off of a hand, so that your crime would be visible to all for the rest of your life. And for the most serious offenses like treason, the punishments were designed to be as agonizing and horrifying as possible, with methods like being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This wasn't a system of justice, it was a system of control, wielded by the powerful to enforce order through fear and superstition. We've spoken about the serf, the healer, and the criminal, but what about the experiences that were unique to half the population? For a medieval woman, life was a tightrope walk over a chasm of dangers, defined by a rigid social and religious structure that viewed her as the weaker vessel. Her identity was almost always tied to a man. She was a daughter, then a wife, and if she was lucky enough to outlive her husband, a widow. Her primary purpose in this world was twofold: to work and to produce heirs, and the second of those duties was perhaps the most dangerous task in the entire medieval world. Childbirth was a life or death event. With no understanding of germs, no surgical interventions like C-sections, and only the folk wisdom of midwives to rely on, the birthing chamber was a place of extreme peril. Complications that are routine for us today, a breech birth, a hemorrhage, were almost always a death sentence for both the mother and the child. A woman might endure 10 or more pregnancies in her lifetime, with a significant number of those children not surviving infancy. Each pregnancy was a gamble with her own life, a biological roulette she was forced to play over and over again for the sake of continuing her husband's lineage. Beyond this recurring mortal danger, her daily life was one of unceasing labor. A peasant woman was expected to do everything a man did in the fields, during peak times like planting and harvesting, but her work didn't end there. She was also solely responsible for running the household. This meant tending the vegetable garden, milking the cow, raising the children, cooking the meals, and, crucially, producing textiles. She would spend countless hours spinning wool into thread and weaving that thread into the rough cloth needed to make her family's clothes. Brewing ale, the calorie-rich drink that was a staple of the medieval diet, was also women's work. Her labor was essential, the absolute bedrock of the household economy, yet she had few, if any, legal rights. She couldn't own land, she couldn't appear in court on her own behalf, and her marriage was often an economic arrangement decided by her father. Yet despite this, women were not simply passive victims. They were the resilient core of the family, the keepers of the hearth, the healers, the midwives, and the silent, indispensable engines that kept the medieval world turning. For a serf tied to the land, the medieval city could seem like a beacon of hope. There was a law in some places, Stadt lieft macht frei, or city air makes you free, which said that a serf who lived within a city's walls for a year and a day became a free man. Lured by the promise of liberty and the chance to learn a trade in a guild, many took the risk and fled to urban centres. But the freedom they found came with its own set of deadly perils. The medieval city was an overcrowded, filthy and violent cauldron where life was cheap and death was always around the corner. The walls that offered protection from invading armies also created a claustrophobic prison. As populations grew, cities couldn't expand outward, so they grew upward. Timber and thatch houses were built tall and narrow, with each floor jutting out over the one below until the roofs nearly touched above the dark, airless streets. Sunlight rarely reached the muddy ground, creating a maze of shadowy alleys and winding passages. In this environment, two constant fears dominated everyone's life: fire and crime. With homes made of flammable materials and heating and cooking reliant on open hearths, fire was an existential threat. A single careless moment, a stray spark from a chimney could start a blaze that, fanned by the wind through the packed-in buildings, could devastate entire city blocks in a matter of hours. There was no professional fire department. Your only hope was a bucket brigade formed by your neighbours, a woefully inadequate defence against a raging inferno. At night, the darkness brought its own terrors. There was no public street lighting. The alleyways became the domain of thieves and cutthroats. The night watch was often ineffective, more concerned with ensuring the city gates were locked than with patrolling the dangerous back streets. If you were attacked, your screams would likely be swallowed by the noise of the city or simply ignored. The city offered a chance to escape servitude, but it was a dangerous gamble, trading the prison of the land for the deadly lottery of the urban streets.
In our modern world, we view childhood as a precious, protected time of innocence, learning and play. This idea would have been completely alien to people in the Middle Ages. For them, childhood was not a sanctuary. It was a perilous gauntlet that had to be survived. The single most brutal fact of medieval life was the staggering rate of infant and child mortality. It's estimated that as many as 1/3 of all children died before their first birthday, and reaching the age of 5 was a major milestone. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents were a constant presence, and the loss of a child was a tragically common feature of family life. For those who did survive these treacherous early years, childhood was short. The concept of being a kid didn't really exist. As soon as a child was physically capable, they were viewed as a miniature adult and were expected to contribute to the family's survival. By the age of 6 or 7, a peasant child would already have chores. They would be out in the fields, scaring birds away from the crops, gathering firewood, fetching water, or tending to the family's pig or chickens. Play was a luxury. Work was the reality. In the towns, a child might be sent off at a similar age to become an apprentice, living and working under a master craftsman, enduring long hours and harsh discipline in exchange for learning a trade. Education, as we know it, was reserved for the sons of the nobility or those destined for a life in the church. A commoner had no need to read or write. Their education was purely practical, learning the skills needed to farm the land or perform a craft, just as their parents had. Discipline was severe and physical. The prevailing belief was spare the rod and spoil the child, and beatings were a standard method for correcting behavior. This wasn't necessarily seen as cruel, but as a necessary duty to shape a child into a hard-working and obedient adult. The medieval world was too harsh to accommodate the idleness or rebellion of youth. Childhood was not a time to be cherished. It was a dangerous probationary period that, if survived, quickly gave way to a lifetime of labor. In a world filled with tangible threats, disease, famine, violence, there was another layer of fear that was just as potent, the fear of the unseen. The medieval mind did not operate like ours. It was not a scientific or rational worldview. It was one steeped in magic, faith, and a profound belief that the physical world was intertwined with a realm of spirits, demons, and supernatural forces. Every unexplained event, every stroke of bad luck, had a potential supernatural cause. A sudden sickness wasn't just a random illness. It could be a curse from an angry neighbor. A cow that stopped giving milk might be bewitched. A storm that ruined the crops was a sign of God's wrath or the devil's work. This fear was most potent during the night. We can't truly appreciate the totality of darkness before electricity. When the sun went down, the world, especially in rural villages, was plunged into an oppressive, inky blackness, broken only by the flickering light of a hearth or a candle. The familiar forest that bordered the village, a place of work and resources by day, transformed into a terrifying and alien landscape at night. It was believed to be the domain of goblins, malevolent spirits, and worse. People huddled in their small, dark homes telling stories of ghosts and monsters, the howling wind outside sounding like the cries of demons. The church offered one framework for understanding this battle between good and evil, with God and his angels fighting against Satan and his demons. But alongside this official doctrine ran a deep current of older pagan folk beliefs. People believed in fairies who could steal babies, in spirits that haunted crossroads, and in the power of charms and amulets to ward off the evil eye. This belief system created a constant, low-level paranoia. The fear of witchcraft was particularly corrosive. While the large-scale witch hunts were more of a feature of the early modern period, the foundational fear was born in the Middle Ages. An old woman who lived alone, perhaps one who knew about herbal remedies, could easily become the scapegoat for a village's misfortunes. In a world where so much was out of their control, blaming a witch was a way to make sense of tragedy. This ever-present fear of the supernatural was a heavy psychological burden, another invisible hardship in the daily struggle to simply exist. At the very top of the social pyramid, far from the peasant in the field, stands the figure that has come to define the Middle Ages in our imagination, the knight in shining armor. He is the hero of our stories, chivalrous, noble, an expert swordsman fighting for honor and glory. But this romantic image is just that, a romance. The reality of being a medieval warrior was a brutal, filthy, and exhausting business, where the greatest threat wasn't a dragon or a rival knight, but the simple realities of disease and exhaustion. Let's start with that shining armor. A full suit of plate armor in the late Middle Ages could weigh over 50 pounds or 25 kilograms. Now imagine wearing that weight, distributed all over your body, on a hot day. Just moving was a workout. The heat inside the metal shell was suffocating, and heat stroke was a genuine and deadly risk. Your vision was reduced to a narrow slit. Your breathing was labored, and the noise of your own movement and the clamor of battle was a deafening roar. It was less like being a superhero and more like fighting from inside a poorly ventilated personal oven, and the battle itself wasn't a series of clean, honorable duels. It was a chaotic, terrifying scrum of mud, blood, and screaming men. You were more likely to be bludgeoned with a mace or stabbed through a weak point in your armor with a dagger than to engage in a skillful sword fight. But the single greatest killer on any military campaign wasn't the enemy's blade, it was disease. Armies were essentially mobile cities with absolutely no sanitation. Thousands of men and horses living in close quarters with contaminated water and mounds of waste created a perfect breeding ground for sickness. Dysentery, known as the bloody flux, would rip through a camp, incapacitating and killing far more soldiers than any battle. A knight was more likely to die shivering in a tent from a fever than he was to die gloriously in combat. Siege warfare was even worse, a slow grind of starvation and misery where attackers would use trebuchets to launch diseased animal carcasses over the walls, engaging in a primitive form of biological warfare. The life of a warrior was not one of glory, it was one of grime guts and a constant, unwinnable war against infection. And so, our journey through the grim realities of the Middle Ages comes to an end. We have walked through the filth of their cities, felt the gnawing hunger of their famines, and recoiled from the terror of their medicine. We've seen a world governed by superstition, bound by a rigid social order, and shattered by the horrors of plague. We have seen that life, for everyone from the lowest serf to the noblest knight, was a constant, grueling struggle against forces that are almost unimaginable to us today. The romantic veneer of castles and chivalry, when scratched, reveals a much harder, darker, and more complex truth. The point of this exploration is not to look back with a sense of superiority, but with a sense of profound respect. It's to understand the sheer, unbelievable resilience of the human spirit. The people who endured these conditions were not lesser than us. In many ways, they were tougher. They survived in a world that was actively trying to kill them at every turn. Despite the hardships, they forged communities, they raised families, they built soaring cathedrals, and they laid the very foundations of the world we now inhabit. Their survival was not guaranteed, it was earned every single day through grit, ingenuity, and an endurance that is difficult to fathom. So the next time you drink a clean glass of water, take an antibiotic for an infection, or simply walk down a clean, well-lit street at night, perhaps you'll have a new appreciation for how much has changed. The distance between our world and theirs is measured not just in centuries, but in the countless lives that were lived and lost in the pursuit of a safer, healthier, and more just existence. They endured the darkness so that eventually we could live in the light. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the unvarnished past. I hope this story has been both informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed this exploration, please consider leaving a like, sharing it with someone else who loves history, and subscribing for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Until next time, take care and rest well.